welcome to Digital Marketing Europe. This is day 2. I'm Katie Stoddart. I am the host and speaker and mainly hosting today more than speaking for this Search World track today. And we've just come off a fantastic session with Dixon Jones. Really interesting in terms of SEO and how to see SEO in terms of entities. Very, very interesting. And now we're going to dive into indexing websites. So indexing websites are very heavy industry in terms of resources. And many webmasters, maybe you're one of them, are highlighting indexing issues. Could it be that instead of this, we could look at indexing prioritizing? And this will maybe become then the SEO's major evolution. This is what we're about to find out now. Our next speaker is the head of technical SEO at Salt Agency, a globally recognized leader in the SEO space. He's credited for coining the term Edge SEO. I like the sound of it, and has worked with many companies to support them in developing best practices and demand generation strategies. Please show a very warm welcome to the stage, right in the chat, if you're excited to hear Dan Taylor.
Hi, Katie. Good afternoon.
Hi, lovely to see you. Afternoon, it's morning here, but yes, good morning, good afternoon. Wonderful to have you here. I'll leave you the stage and I'll come back for the Q&A.
Awesome, thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever in the world you are. And thank you to Digital Marketing Europe for having me again for a second consecutive year. And following Dixon's presentation is no mean feat, but I shall do my best to inform and entertain over the next half hour as best I can. So, as Katie alluded to, the topic I'm going to be kind of addressing today is crawling indexing strategies for large enterprise and problematic websites. But this is something which will transcend, in my opinion, down to the mid-market and SME level as well, especially with how we're seeing the evolution of Index Now and other protocols, and especially impacts we're seeing from core updates. So I shall give a quick introduction to myself. So as Katie said, I'm head of technical SEO at Salt Agency. We're one of the only SEO agencies in the world to actually have a royal seal of approval, having won the Queen's Award for Innovation last year. And we specialise in innovative and pioneering growth strategies and excellence for mid-market to enterprise brands. If anyone wants to reach out to me directly after this, please don't send me links. My email address is there. So I'm going to kick this off with a standard John Mueller quote, because no SEO talk is really complete without a Google quote thrown in there. And this is a couple of years old now, but essentially still rings true, where in a Webmaster Hangout he was asked about index rates of websites, and it's typically normal for 20% of a website not to be indexed, and it's normal that we don't index everything. This is a shift in thinking for what was happening 10 years ago, and also for me needs to be a shift in how we as SEO start thinking about things, especially for websites which are relatively large, complex, and have convoluted structures which they might meet technical best practices, but it varies in terms of the content regard. So we can break this down into 3 buckets. The technical rationale as to why websites and web pages aren't being indexed. Then you go into the content reasons, and then the simplest one is Google system reasons, because we have very little insight into those. And with anything, the caveat here is that the lines between these buckets get very blurry, and what works in one situation will probably not verbatim work copy and paste across others. So first I'm going to go through the technical reasons, the content reasons, and a bit of a Google uptime, and then I'm going to talk about the more complex sides of this, for example, how Google handles canonicalization, and not just the canonical tag, but the other signals, but then also how we can actively try to curb these issues or try to influence this, and how we go around the conversations around prioritization and making sure our key pages, our revenue drivers, our lead generation drivers are actually being indexed, crawled consistently, and moving away from the ideology that 100% indexed is potentially a reality moving forward. So with technical reasons, they're oftentimes extremely easy to troubleshoot and they're extremely easy to find issues with. Now, these can be done through standard crawling. The majority of tools have this baked in nowadays. But that's where it also gets confusing. For example, the crawl directions and the crawlability of a website, we can block this with robots.txt lines. We can remove or we can produce internal links without A tags so Google can't find them. And we can also have issues with JavaScript websites where we're just not rendering internal links properly, meaning that Google and other search engines actually can't find them. The indexing directives, again, relatively easy to troubleshoot. You have the no index metas, the HTTPs. I think up until 4 years ago, we could also do that for robots.txt, but I think that was September 2019 we lost that. And then canonicals, which is another indexing directive, but I have put the asterisk there because when we talk about canonicals, we oftentimes just look at simply a canonical tag and the self-referencing canonical tag. But canonicalization is a much more complex issue than that. And then the third technical one is simple, it's your status code returns. Are we consistently returning 200s? Do we throw out server errors with 500s? Are we doing silly things for CDN? Or are we tar pitting bots which are hitting too frequently and raising false flagging tools? Are we, in some instances, I've seen people actually block Googlebot after a certain number of requests because it was being too aggressive and requesting too many pages and not a user. So there's things which we can find both at different levels of infrastructure, middleware, and the hardware itself. Moving on to why canonicals are more complex than just the tag, because when we test this technically and all tools, we will literally look for that canonical tag. We'll say, yep, canonical tag in the meta, or there might be an X canonical in the HTTP header. Does it self-reference? Yes, no. Similarly, and some best practices are, but say on e-commerce websites, if we have similar products or we have parameters, we'll choose to canonical them to roots or non-parameter versions because we're cleaning up indexing signals. The canonical tag, however, is just one of, I think it's around 20 actual canonicalization signals Google takes into account. I've put more than a dozen on there, but it's typically around 20, but you can bundle them all into around about 10 if you want to be more concise. All of them are weighted differently. All of them are weighted differently in different circumstances, and it's very much case dependent. We can also look at this from a technical perspective of canonicals, that if the head doesn't render or the head breaks and Google's unable to actually see the canonical if we're using the meta route, it has no directive of which to make a choice. Therefore, it will take into account the other soup of signals and make a decision that way on where best to actually serve content to meet and need user queries. That is kind of more of a black and white monochromatic approach for a sense that we can see if a canonical is being rendered. If it's not being rendered, we can relatively fix it. Simple technical change, implementation probably will resolve the issue because before Google was kind of looking in the dark, we've shone a light. Where it now gets messy is that from a content/quality perspective, and this isn't just about length and other things, it's everything that goes into Google's determination of page quality. So even if it can render the canonical, we need to remember and go back to the fact that the canonical tag is a directive, not a verbatim signal. It's not like a no index. It can be overridden. It's not like a robots.txt directive. It can be overridden. So it will follow all the other signals. Mostly all the other signals were shared by Gary Illiers at SEO Day last year, and I'm reporting this secondhand through Patrick Stocks. But essentially, other things that are taken into account, and all these again are weighted differently, are everything from whether or not the page is seen as a duplicate. So that isn't just a duplicate as in verbatim content on the page is via the same. It's whether or not the content, the perspective meets the same value proposition and the search intent as another page and can be seen as competitive or cannibalization or cannibalistic in our terms. XML sitemap inclusion, again, is a signal, but generally speaking, we optimize XML sitemaps to include all the pages we want indexed, regardless if they, and most of the time, that contains canonical conflicts and other elements just because of how certain web systems are built. Is it a strong signal? Yes, no, depends on situations. Internal links and external links again, they go into canonicalization. Through internal linking, it's your consistency of your internal links, it's your consistency of anchors used, and it's the consistency of a message going to those individual pages. External links again follows the same element. If you've got a lot of links going to a certain page with a certain anchor, and say for example that could be a blog, but then you want the commercial page to actually rank for those terms, it's another signal Google has to take into account, and simply canonicalizing the blog to the commercial page could see that being overridden just purely because of what Google thinks users want to see. And again, links are an early form of vote system that Google uses to assess popularity, so makes sense. Alternates is slightly more complex, and that basically goes down to your hreflang versions. So if you have an English US, English UK, English Ireland, English Canada, they're all seen as alternate, and this is where you see in hreflang reporting where Google overrides canonicals and will basically ignore hreflang and serve different country alternates in those country versions because it's seen them both as duplicates as well as different elements. Again, URL length can be a factor in canonicalization. Domain level signals also falls into there, so topical relevancy for the actual topic you're trying to rank for, overall strength of brand, expectancy if your brand's meant to be seen. That's kind of a large bucket, but the plethora of everything that goes into EEAT and then maps to every other signal which we can't really measure, but we do through things like DA and DR because we needed a page rank replacement. Redirects is a very strong canonical signal. Also then takes into account content origin. So if a New York Times published a piece of content first and then it was reproduced by an aggregator, content origin sticks with New York Times. So again, that's a strong signal for who to rank above others. And then also Google user data plays a part. So things like quickbacks on the SERPs, or if people are searching for brand and then doing brand plus a resource name or different elements just so they can try to source the right page for the right query in a kind of a SERP stacking approach with searches. Touching on this again, the canonicalization rules aren't consistent even on the same domain. So what might work in one situation might not work in another because they typically work at a heavy query level, and then they can work at different levels across different site sections because Google can make assumptions on a website based on sections by URL pattern, something which I'm going to come on to later as part of sub-X theory, but the canonical signals all carry different weights. So it's about taking into account the wider ecosystem of a domain when trying to assess canonical issues, and sometimes it can be something really simple as just tweaking a couple of headers and improving value proposition on the page, or whole scale changes and pruning of poor performing content and improving entire sub areas to improve indexability of new content because that is performing poorly. So there's no golden rule to this. There's no checklist. There's no targeted element. It's just going through Search Console data and other elements, which I'll list later on as to how to actually troubleshoot this and find a way of not 100% indexing the website, but actually making sure all pages you actually really care about are indexed. A common one with this canonical issue is this, which appears in Search Console all the time, and it's about the duplicate. Google chose different canonical than user. This typically is where things get messy because people see duplicate as it being the same. It's the same content, the same elements. It's not. It's just that Google has identified potentially that there's a value proposition of the content has been essentially seen as exactly the same. This can be targeting similar keywords with commercial pages and blogs, or landing pages are different. And it's typically seen where, and more common when you try to do more of a direct individual search term per page strategy versus trying to do consolidated terms on multiple pages to create a higher value proposition. It can also be a technical issue that causes this. For example, in SPAs and JavaScript applications, it depends on how the content renders or hydrates. It could be that they just load up blank sometimes, And then obviously if we're rendering a blank page to Google, Google will see the blanks. If it's not rendering a canonical in the DOM, it's making a choice. So all it thinks is just loads of blank pages until the web rendering service comes around. And by that point, you still could be in a quagmire of issues. So yeah. And this is also similar to why hreflang is sometimes ignored. Canonicalization is crazy and in-depth, but is greatly impactful to actually the wider indexing sphere, and not just which page Google chooses to rank for different elements or which one we want it to rank. So the breakdown of this simply, which you can communicate, is that if it ignores a self-referencing canonical, it thinks it's either down to value proposition duplication or verbatim duplication. The value proposition duplication I've already covered. The verbatim duplication can literally be very common on e-commerce websites where you have a pair of sneakers which also has red, blue, green, yellow variations, and the literal difference between them is an SKU and a photo. There's not enough value proposition difference there really to warrant all 6 versions being indexed. So Google might index the primary version and a prominent version, or a couple of the more prominent versions which people are searching for, e.g. red shoe brand size 10. It will try to index the red version of that because that's what people want, not necessarily what, as SEOs, we're trained to do by looking at the root all the time. If it's ignoring a canonical, say, from going from URL A to URL B, that's where we go into the soup. And it's going to be the other canonicalization factors as to why it's being ignored, or it could just be simply disagreeing with it based on our data. And again, this is more common when we try to follow a blind best practice versus taking into account the site ecosystem, and how people are actually trying to search to get there with value intent, not just for search terms. This also brings me on to Index Now, which is, in my opinion, being misused for some of these use cases. I mainly think it's being misused because I think Index Now is the most badly named thing in SEO currently. Index Now does not guarantee indexing. It acts as a submission to make the search engines who support it, which would be Bing, Yandex, and Seznam currently, that they're now aware BeRel exists. It's a discovery mechanism. Discovery is an extremely expensive and energy-heavy part of how a search engine operates. Through Index Now, you're kind of doing the discovery process for the search engine, and then it passes through the indexing process for Google. That's passing through to caffeine and other elements. So you're cutting out that kind of initial first stage. Index Now obviously indicates it's going to get indexed now, and it's an indexer, but it's not. It's more of a discovery engine, and it's great to see the uptake of people using it for Bing. I know Seznam, I think in the past week, has started supporting it, and also the support for Yandex for it, but you're still going to fall foul of all the other issues of canonicalization and different elements, regardless if you're using Index Now in the get or post method. Which kind of then moves on to my tinfoil hat portion of, are we on the verge of this? Because introduction of Index Now, even the words coming from Google, the words coming from Bing, and even what they publish in their own documentation, the web is just expanding exponentially. Gary Illyes also last year shared a statistic where 60% of the internet is duplicate. That doesn't mean, but the clarifications that is that 60% of the internet isn't duplicate in terms of 60% of the internet is articles on how to boil an egg, or it's the same article rehashed. You've got issues with trailing slash, non-trailing slash, HTTP, HTTPS, free dub subdomains. 60% of the internet is just a cacophony of mess, which hasn't been tamed or catered for. It's an overgrown bush, and all the search engines have to find that valuable 40% whilst competing with that overgrown bush of 60%. If you stop going out to the forest to find that 40% and let the 40% come to you, you're saving a mass amount of resource, because that 60% isn't going to be submitted more often than not, because if it's not being maintained and taken care of, chances are it's not going to be submitted through Index Now or slightly more advanced mechanisms and methods. The other side of this is that discovery is expensive. You still have to go and find URLs, you have to do crawling, you then have to store the data, you then have to remember that you've crawled it and discovered it, then you have to remember that it's low quality, so you're not going to do anything with it. And the technologies like Index Now completely point to the fact that we're going to see a reduction in that, which means we're going to see a reduction in crawling of new URLs. We're going to see a reduction in uptake of new websites, similar to the Google Sandbox theory for new websites and elements like that. That's why with Index Now or other mechanisms, if Google choose to support it or bring in their own elements, or however they're going to do discovery, that's how we're going to see the shift there. With that, and also the reduction of indexing in a larger size anyway, storing less data, crawling less data, saves more money, and you can also greenwash it as well, which is great for polar bears. So moving on to the content reasons, these again go slightly more complex. So to break this down simply, they're dynamic reasons. So page quality, as Google's definition, is determined at an individual URL level. The key importance is that that page has a beneficial purpose that aligns with what Google wants to show. So a beneficial purpose, as defined by Google, can be to educate, can be to inform, it can be to sell. It could be just to drive people to the page to give you ad impressions, which most journalist sites do kind of now, and blogs. No beneficial purpose is malicious unless it sets out to be, but it might be a different beneficial purpose to what Google actually wants to show. This then goes on to the quality threshold. Now, the quality threshold of whether or not a URL is indexed can variate. So, for example, if you have a URL which is indexed and you submit it via the Google Search Console inspected element for indexing, you might see it become indexed temporarily and then drop out. That's because you doing that manual submission, you've given it a temporary freshness reprieve. The freshness factor has probably just ticked it above the quality threshold. You've then lost your freshness through time decay and you've dropped back below. That means work on other things and don't just keep spamming Search Console with it, because you're just going to keep having this up and down whack-a-mole effect, and it's not going to be consistent. But then what's important is that the quality threshold is then different for what Google classes as different source types, which is where keyword difficulty scores for SERPs really fall apart then and become almost meaningless, because if you're in a competitive niche and you do a search term which by Google's definition has multiple common interpretations, and given that Google wants to diversify the SERPs, you may have 3 or 4 commercial results ranking for a product, then you might have 2 or 3 chaotic neutral review sites like TechRadar or GQ Magazine or something like that. And then you might have a couple of independent stores, maybe a map pack and some local stores, local to IP. All of those are different source types. So the quality threshold for what is actually being warranted on my SERP is different. So if you aggregate a keyword difficulty score across all those 10 results, it's meaningless, because they're all being, you're not comparing 10 apples, you're comparing 4 apples, 3 pineapples, and 2 mangoes. You're not going to have the same results. So that's where the SERP analysis comes in, and identifying if your content is the right source type, is the right perspective, and where on that page you can potentially fit in by how Google wants to structure it with a diversification. You then work the quality threshold for your source type, and then you work with your page type to actually match your perspective, which is where your indexing comes in with page quality. Now, all this is determined at query level, so you probably can cluster a certain number of queries together if the pages are similar, but generally speaking, again, it's a query cluster level or query level individually if you want to try and scale it. That then moves on to the most frustrating part, and probably one of the most harder to understand elements of Search Console, and that is the discovered not currently indexed. Because the thought process is, well, if Google's discovered it, how come it's not moved to crawled, not currently indexed? And this comes down to assumption based and also the quality based on either the subfolder, subdomain. Google classes it as doing it based on a URL pattern. So essentially, if you're if you have a section of your website which is /cheese, then /French, and then that entire section is bad content, it's not helpful, it's not got any unique perspectives, there is no need for that content to exist on the internet because it adds nothing to the ecosystem. And then you produce 5 more French cheese pages, Google's making the assumption that you're not going to be of a similar quality, so it deprioritizes it in the crawl queue, mass deprioritization, so you're not actually going to move there. So yeah, in order to fix this, you have to do the subfolder optimization, something I'm going to cover in a little bit of how to actually do that on a level playing field, because obviously if you do it by session data and keywords, some are greater than others. So you need to do ratios to find middle grounds to actually look at where the opportunities lie. Then the final thing on this and what I want to mention is around the beneficial purpose element. And this is where some pages get lost in just the quagmire. And that's essentially where you have a page targeting a certain topic. You'll then also create an FAQ on that page. You'll also add in the informational queries. So anyone looking at that page will see 3,000 words of effectively an almost encyclopedic introduction of a service or product. And when Google looks at that, there's no clear definition of what the main content is. Is the main content the commercial bit at the top? Is it the FAQ section? Is it the what questions, the why questions, the how? Is it the comparison content? What is the purpose of this page? Or is it just that the purpose of this page has been hammered to hell with SEO, but it wants to rank for everything to do with these terms and it wants to be seen as a single page authority? If they can't identify the beneficial purpose, regardless of how well that meets a user's needs, because in principle, one page, every answer you want on a certain topic, fantastic, you don't have to click anywhere else, it's always going to have the lowest page quality because it hasn't got a direct beneficial purpose. It's the jack of all trades, master of none kind of page, and that's more of a remnant from 5-6 years ago, but it's still something we see coming through now in over-optimization of certain content elements, and in some niches it works, but in the majority it doesn't. So the easiest one to explain out of this, simply because of how much of a black hole it is essentially for Google system reasons, and they come down to your crawl budget and also your crawl tier / allocation. So, being honest, probably 99% of the websites out there don't need to actually worry about crawl budget. Every website has a form of crawl budget, and they vary, and they will also increase and decrease as time happens. If you publish more content, you'll probably see a increase in discovery purpose for Googlebot, and then you'll see a increase in refresh over time, and then it'll probably plateau more on refresh than anything else, because there's no point trying to do more discovery if you're not actually publishing new things for it to discover. What you can do through monitoring your logs is look at the crawl frequencies, and then also use things like the Search Console API to actually then start looking at lead times for crawl to index and different elements. Then you have your crawl to allocation notice. That is essentially increasing your crawl budget comes with actually just being more relevant. The more important the website, which is usually determined by the more queries you rank for, the more prominently you rank for those queries, and the amount of eyes that the users put on those queries generally increases your importance in all Google systems. Typically, when core updates are rolled out, you see it impact search queries with a higher search volume first than others, and they usually get refined first and quicker as well, because is Google going to annoy people searching for a 500,000 a month query? Or is it going to prioritize a 50 a month query over it? And it will go after the 500,000 every day of the week and twice on a Sunday, because that's where more people look. That's where more ad spend is. And it's crazy because Google, again, being a product, has to be frictionless as a user experience. So that brings me on to my final kind of bit, which is how can we actually strategize the indexing for websites? And that falls into 3 kind of categories. It's how we influence discovery, how we influence the actual crawl itself, and then how we try to influence indexing. Indexing strategies do rely on more than just box ticks. I mean, just looking at how complex canonicalization is and how that impacts everything when some directives are verbatim and some are not, can cause issues if you try to take the linear approach. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was relatively linear, but also, again, if you think 8 years ago, we still have mobile subdomains on most websites. We've evolved a lot in 7, 8 years. You're either in the index box or you're not now. How you actually get there is going to be query level dependent, and is going to depend on other elements and factors as to how you're actually producing content on your site, and how the competitive cohort you're against is also producing content. Another key part of the strategy is actually developing the communication and setting expectations with CD and VP level. And this typically comes to a point of generally when you have VP level go into Search Console and they start seeing, because again, Search Console has very poor labeling. It needs to evolve, in my opinion, in that regard. But where you see things like, oh, here's an indexing error. Why is it an indexing error? Because we've redirected all those pages that used to exist because we restructured. Is it actually an error then because we intended to do it? No. Again, it's trying to set the expectations. This approach will differ because CDVPs have a different level of SEO knowledge and understanding. Some might come at it with a paid background, some will come with more of a broad spectrum marketing element, but they won't understand these weird nuances that as SEOs we're paid to essentially understand and inform on. But all indexing strategies, regardless, start at the discovery stage. And this is where we want to do as much as we can to warrant this and not get stuck in that. Just if you're getting stuck in discovered, not currently indexed, that means you're not either doing enough on the current site with current pages to actually show that you have a quality in that subsection of the site or at a domain level to actually move things along. So it's not so much optimizing new pages, it's refining the current ecosystem to sustain life of new pages. As I said, within part of me moving forward, new websites and less authoritative websites, I think we could see discovery phases lasting longer over time, or targeting new queries or branching into new things not typically in the wheelhouse, just because you develop a specialism and you develop relationships with entities and topical authority. A little quote from me, which I've put in a few of my decks, is that 100% indexed also needs to be something potentially not communicated to certain C levels, especially depending on sites. And we need to start looking at index prioritization and working closer with other marketing stakeholders, people who want to look after brand, people who look after customer service, problem solving. So rather than SEO becoming this channel that brings in acquisition and leads and generation, we become an RDA, an ADR channel almost, even from a technical perspective. We do the attraction, we do the development, and we do the retention, because we have to work with the other stakeholders to make sure if people are searching for our brand plus a problem or our brand plus a comparison, we're part of that conversation, and ensuring that other stakeholders are part of that conversation from the get-go helps understanding moving forward and helps them set realistic expectations themselves and how they can influence with their campaigns. The ways to go around, essentially, you need to assess your main page content. The main content, as defined by the Google Quality Rating Guidelines, is essentially the main reason the page exists. It plays the utmost role in determining page quality. But then you also have your supplementary content, which can help a page better achieve its experience. That can either be on the page itself or can be linked to the subpages. And then an important note is that many pages do have advertisements and ads, but that itself isn't a reason for high or low quality. It's how it detracts from a main page quality experience. A good example of that in how that can detract and also impact user data is an example I always like to pull up. I was trying to watch I think it was either Champions League or Europa League. It's Arsenal. It could be either. When they were playing Mold, and essentially, if you think about the query, it's a very short-term focus. I'm not going to be making this query the day after. I'm doing it 2-3 hours before. The user objective and the beneficial purpose needed to meet is very clear. This piece of content itself was extremely fresh, and I don't know if my face is in the way from that last bit of text, but essentially this is a Radio Times article, and it was, yep, I've now moved. And it was ranking in position 1, behind a featured snippet, a YouTube, and a people also asked. So it was a first linear organic result. The actual answer to my query was 173 words, 2 adverts, and a subscription box further down the page. On a mobile, that's about 12 inches of scrolling, and also because of the way the adverts load in, was a lot of CLS. That's what we're trying to deal with. So if you're creating experiences like this, and when by the time other publications have published to answer the Radio Times' query here, they were kind of first out the gate, they lost ranking for more linear, easier results. And the whole premise of this article was literally the title, "What channel is Arsenal being molded on?" And yet the TTR, the time to result, was so far down the page, when other people answered it quicker, they lost the ranking. This is why we need to look at things like the sub-X ecosystem. So by sub-X, I mean this can be a subfolder, subdomain, anything like that. Google makes the assumptions based on domain quality, based on the URL patterns. So this is typically going to be subfolders or strings in URLs which are consistent. Quality isn't just the length of the content or the number of clicks or sessions it gets. I see a lot of people who recommend just killing blog content en masse just because it doesn't meet a certain click threshold. But it's about how useful the content is versus the intent. And if Google's indexing something, despite it being low traffic, it sees value in it. So just because it's not meeting a certain click threshold, why don't we just use it for internal linking? Why don't we just use it for answering those low element queries? It's still brand visibility. It's still search visibility. We're using an arbitrary metric or a threshold in our head of what quality is by performance. Easy ways to do this, I found, are to take your sections and to create ratios of the mean number of clicks I received per page. Because not all, I mean, if you have 3 subfolders and all the pages in those subfolders all basically the same number of pages and we all get the same number of clicks, you're in the same boat. But in some situations, you'll be comparing subfolders with 130,000 clicks to subfolders with, say, 10,000 clicks. You can't draw a comparison from there. So if you do a mean click to page average based on that ecosystem, you can start looking at trends. And then also you pull through things like the Google Search Console API into Screaming Frog or Looker or BigQuery or something like that, and actually start doing index comparisons to actually see where you stand in terms of indexing, performance, and even call frequency from log files if you want to overlay that data. The last couple of ones, because I appreciate I'm running on time, is the canonical signal whack-a-mole. And the 6 basic ones of this are to have a look: sitemap, XML sitemap inclusion. Standard practice is that every page we want to be indexed is included in XML sitemaps. Break them up into multiple, because then you get much better data out of Google Search Console on a granular level, and it doesn't impact indexing or anything like that. Have a look at your internal link anchor consistency. So are you pointing useful anchor text towards all the pages, and are they consistent? Are they consistent in terms of not just the anchor text, but are you put the context around it? Is it commercial text you're pointing to it? Therefore, should it be going to a blog? This is where automated internal linking tools can fall down. Again, hreflang, the alternate versions of the same language, they mainly affect websites in English and Spanish, currency, and different even small changes to like even the English language, like adding in S's and Z's and U's in different places, isn't a differentiator. That then goes into value proposition duplicates, so poorly targeted keywords, badly constructed cluster models. If you try to do pillar and spoke or column or whatever hub kind of model you want to follow. And then you've got your basically crux and runs, your core web vitals, your time to result, better UX, influence it the best you can to reduce the user friction. And then obviously the canonical tag issues as well. Google Search Console is your friend in overwriting, analyzing your canonical issues. Sometimes it is too top level, so you do have to actually dive in and report it. Just because they might be bundled into the same error screen on Search Console doesn't mean they're all going to have the same resolution. And the other element is Truststone is with migrations, because I'm seeing this happen more and more over the last 6 months. And we know that redirects are heavy localization waiting. And I'm seeing knee-jerk reactions 2-3 weeks after a major migration's happened, where you're comparing real domains to a new domain and not all the traffic. And essentially, there is going to be a lag time. There will be dual indexing, and you'll need to consolidate the other signals around this. So things you can take away to go through today. I appreciate I'm running on time, so I'm going to whistle through the last kind of 3 slides here. And I will make these available, is essentially get your log files in your GSC API, cross-reference the data, make sure if it's being crawled, if it's being crawled frequently, if you want to index and it's not being crawled frequently, increase internal links, do systems around this. HTML sitemaps can be a quick win in these instances. With e-commerce platforms, you'll have a lot of product pages or PLPs, or the PDP product good pages, which are very kind of unique, very non-unique, and have a lot of information duplicated across other websites. So you need to find your USP in actually increasing that. Now that can be an additional sentence of content, or even just how you have a perspective added in there as well to demonstrate authority or EEAT-ness. And then also gravitate around the USP as well. So use budget, use cheap, use expensive, use free delivery, throw those USPs onto there to give it a override function for Google to see value. And then the last one is, again, just touching on international again, currency is not a differentiator. You need to use full localization and value proposition localization, and that will stop the folding problem with indexing across international. And that is everything. Thank you. Apologies for the last bits being a bit running.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was super in-depth. I was taking lots of notes. I learned loads of new terms also. So I imagine that the SEO experts out there have a lot to discover. So maybe just where can people find you and write to you if they have questions? Maybe I bring up the slide again.
No, absolutely. So I'm on Twitter, Taylor Dan RW. If you want to drop me an email kind of directly, I'm Dan at Sol.agency. Please don't try and sell me links. And also I'm at Sol.agency as well. Online if you want to kind of submit a form or read some blogs and other bits.
Amazing, especially for those who will be watching this on replay. Thank you so much. I think it's a bit just time-wise for questions, but I think people are processing and probably thinking about it, and you covered so many things in depth. So thank you so much, Dan. It was lovely to meet you. And yes, and for those who are listening, stay tuned because the next talk is with Gigius Morganus on a case study and how they actually use an SEO-based strategy. So what you just said, Dan, and what's coming up, really we have your SEO covered. Thank you so much for today, Dan.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
This is all we got. Remember the revolution in our minds. This is all we got. Lock me out of this life institution. I am angry and high on illusions. Yes, I hate, but it's not a solution. Try my best, but I'm just a human. Oh.